The 37th Mr. Olympia took place from October 26th to 28th, 2001 at the Mandalay Bay Events Center in Las Vegas. But this wasn't just another Olympia weekend. The world was still reeling from the September 11th attacks, which had happened only 6 weeks earlier. The mood across the United States was tense. Security was tighter than ever, and there was a sense of patriotism you could almost feel in the air. And that energy was going to show up on stage, too. Backstage, security was on a whole different level. Police officers walked the hallways, access points were restricted, and the vibe felt completely different from previous years. This wasn't just a bodybuilding show. It was a major national event unfolding during one of the most sensitive moments in modern American history. The audience wasn't just looking for entertainment. They were looking for something meaningful, something symbolic. Right in the middle of it all was Ronnie Coleman. The three-time champ was coming off a legendary showing at the Arnold Classic earlier that year, a look many still consider the best condition of his entire career. Mass, density, conditioning, everything looked dialed in. The question floating around forums and bodybuilding magazines was simple. Could anyone even come close to touching him? His biggest rival up to that point, Flex Wheeler, had retired. That pretty much erased any expectation of a real showdown. Most people assumed this Olympia would be just another confirmation of Ronnie's dominance, a predictable coronation, almost a formality. But what no one realized was that behind that apparent calm, one of the most dramatic battles in bodybuilding history was about to unfold. When the first call out of prejudging began, something already felt off script. Center stage stood Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, and Kevin Levrone. That's where the tone of the entire contest would be set. And within seconds, the crowd could tell this afternoon wasn't going to go the way everyone expected. Ronnie was bigger, much bigger, roughly 30 pounds heavier than he was at the Arnold Classic just months earlier. That's about 13.5 kilograms for those using the metric system. But that extra weight didn't look like just dry, grainy muscle. From the front, especially in the midsection, there was a softness that hadn't been there before. The dramatic X-frame silhouette that dominated the Arnold stage wasn't quite as sharp this time. Across from him stood Jay Cutler, younger, hungrier, and clearly on a mission. His midsection looked tighter, his quads were deeply separated and striated, and from the front his physique appeared cleaner and more balanced. In the front poses, he wasn't just hanging with the champ, he was pushing him. The tension built with every comparison. And then came the shock. Cutler took the first 2 rounds. Symmetry and muscularity. When the score sheets started circulating backstage, the news spread fast. Jay Cutler was ahead by 6 points. For the first time in years, Ronnie Coleman was officially behind at Mr. Olympia. What was supposed to be a smooth victory lap was turning into a real fight. When Ronnie found out he was down by 6 points, he didn't react dramatically on stage. It was internal, quiet. Later, he would admit he was stunned. It wasn't something you heard often. The reigning Mr. Olympia trailing after prejudging. For the first time in years, the title felt like it might slip through his hands. He went back to his hotel room and, according to Ronnie himself, picked up the phone to call his family. He asked for prayers. He asked for strength. This wasn't just another contest. His legacy was on the line. Alone in that room, he made a decision. That night, he would walk back on stage ready to do whatever it took to keep that crown. When the lights came up for the finals, something had shifted. Ronnie stepped out more intense, more electric. He swapped his traditional white trunks for a red, white, and blue pair. Midway through his routine, he shocked the crowd by pulling out an American flag that had been hidden backstage. The arena erupted. His routine was long, energetic, and strategic. He knew he was behind, and he needed to create impact. At that time, the individual posing routine counted for 25% of the total score, a massive portion that could swing the final outcome. Ronnie didn't just hit poses. He put on a show. During the pose down, his presence filled the stage. The confidence came back. The momentum shifted. And in that moment, it became clear that Mr. Olympia 2001 wouldn't be decided by physique alone. It would also come down to performance. When it was time for the finals, Jay Cutler did exactly what he had always done. He stepped on stage focused, straight to the point, delivering a clean and efficient routine. No theatrics, no over-the-top moments. His presentation lasted about 2.5 minutes, right within the expected time frame. For him, The most important work had already been done during prejudging earlier that afternoon. But across from him stood a champion who knew he was trailing. Ronnie Coleman didn't walk out there just to go through the motions. He walked out to change the course of history. He stretched out his performance, maximized his stage presence, and used every second under those lights. He understood the situation, and he knew this was the moment to flip the script. The contrast in styles was impossible to ignore. Cutler leaned on physical consistency. Ronnie leaned on presence, intensity, and the authority of a three-time reigning Mr. Olympia. The crowd could feel that something major was unfolding, but no one really knew how the judges would respond to that late surge. Then the announcement came. By just 4 points, Ronnie Coleman was declared the winner. A historic comeback from the afternoon prejudging to the final results that night. What had looked almost settled hours earlier had completely turned around, and the audience was still trying to process what they had just witnessed. The final top 5 looked like this. Ronnie Coleman with 28 points and $110,000 in prize money. Jay Cutler with 32 points and $60,000. Kevin Levrone in 3rd, Sean Ray in 4th, and Chris Cormier in 5th. The total prize purse for the event was $400,000. But on that stage, it was never just about the money. It was about legacy, about history, about walking away either as the man who held the throne or the one who came painfully close on one of the most dramatic nights of the decade. While most people were locked in on the Coleman versus Cutler battle, something just as intense was happening right behind them. If the title was decided by 4 points, the fight for 3rd place was even quieter and almost just as tight. Kevin Levrone, Sean Ray, and Chris Cormier traded positions throughout the rounds in a technical showdown that many fans barely noticed in the emotional chaos of the main event. It was a battle for the podium happening inside the larger battle for the crown. The difference between 3rd and 5th place was only 7 points. In judging terms, that's razor thin. Each of the 3 men managed to outperform the others in at least one round. No one dominated. It came down to small details, angles, transitions, and minor slips. At 36 years old, Sean Ray was making his final appearance at Mr. Olympia. It marked the end of an incredible run, 12 consecutive Olympia appearances, all finishing in the top 5. One of the most consistent physiques of the 1990s was saying goodbye nearly at the top. But that night, his back poses didn't have quite the same sharpness they once did. Chris Cormier, on the other hand, looked especially strong in his legs and rear shots. Many fans still argue he deserved to finish 3rd. Levrone, coming off a runner-up finish the previous year, appeared slightly off his all-time best, yet still secured the bronze. And meanwhile, a young Dexter Jackson placed 8th, a result many believe was far too low considering how complete he looked. Just when it seemed like the storm had finally passed, another bomb dropped backstage. After the event, anti-doping tests revealed that Jay Cutler and Marcus Rule had tested positive for banned diuretics. In a sport where every tiny detail of conditioning matters, that news hit like another shockwave in an already controversial contest. In Cutler's case, things got even more complicated. His 2nd place finish was officially rescinded at first. Think about that. Only days after losing by just 4 points. The entire narrative could have shifted overnight. For many, it felt like the final twist in one of the most debated Olympias ever. But the story didn't end there. Cutler filed legal action to maintain both his placing and the $60,000 prize. Then a crucial detail emerged. The laboratory responsible for the tests was no longer officially accredited by the International Olympic Committee. That raised serious questions about the validity of the results. Because of that discovery, the tests were ultimately invalidated. Jay Cutler officially retained his 2nd place finish and his prize money. On paper, nothing changed. The standings remained intact. But outside of official documents and score sheets, the debate only grew louder. The controversy stopped being just technical. It became permanently woven into the legacy of that Olympia. And while the Coleman versus Cutler showdown dominated headlines, magazines, and message boards, other important stories were being written on that same stage. Almost quietly, almost forgotten in the middle of the main storm. Because Mr. Olympia 2001 wasn't just about one duel. It was a mosaic of defining moments in several athletes' careers. And one of the men who experienced the peak of his journey that night was Orville Burke. Wide, dense, and visually striking, Burke earned 6th place and made it into the final pose down. For many fans, that was the best shape of his entire career, the highest point he would ever reach as a pro. On a night filled with controversy and dramatic swings, he quietly carved out his own story of triumph. Right behind him, in 8th place, stood a name that still wasn't taken too seriously at the time, Dexter Jackson. At 31 years old, he brought a polished, symmetrical, aesthetic physique to the stage. But back then, he was seen as someone still building towards something. Years later, we all know how that story plays out. But in 2001, he was still underestimated. On the opposite end of the curve was Nasser El Sonbadi. Runner-up in 1997, he now appeared smaller and softer, finishing only 9th. It was a clear sign that his peak years were behind him. The sport was evolving. Faster, bigger, more extreme, and not everyone could keep up with that shift. Gunter Schleierkamp also placed far from the top, finishing in 15th. But what makes that result interesting is what came next. That modest placing was just the setup. The following year, he would become one of the most cheered athletes in the sport, launching what fans would call Guntermania. And maybe that's exactly what makes this event so fascinating. Because more than just results, that night left questions. Questions that carried on for years, across magazines, interviews, message boards, and endless debates among fans. Which brings us to the question that never fully goes away. Who really won the 2001 Mr. Olympia? For many fans and analysts, the prejudging numbers tell a clear story. Jay Cutler won the first 2 rounds. He was ahead in symmetry and muscularity. In theory, those phases are supposed to determine who brought the best physique. If judging were purely technical, the decision would have been locked in right there. But bodybuilding is rarely just theory. Looking strictly from the front, the case for Cutler is strong. His midsection was tighter. His quads were more detailed. His overall lines looked cleaner. He appeared drier, sharper, and more balanced in the front poses. In several mandatory shots, he didn't just stand next to the champion, he outperformed him. But bodybuilding isn't judged only from the front. And when the athletes turned around, the narrative shifted. Ronnie Coleman was overwhelming. Deeply striated glutes, etched hamstrings, and a level of back density that visually swallowed the competition. His overall impact was still massive, and in the finals, his performance brought an entirely different kind of dominance. Another key factor, back then, the individual posing routine and the pose down carried real weight in the scoring. Stage presence mattered. Energy mattered. Showmanship mattered. Ronnie leaned all the way into that. Cutler stayed technical and controlled. Ronnie went explosive. That contrast may have tipped the scale. What frustrated many people was the dramatic shift in the scoreboard from afternoon to evening. How does someone leading by 6 points end up losing by 4? Was it Ronnie elevating his performance? Was it the added influence of presentation? Or did the judges reassess what they'd seen? Now here's the real question. If you had been sitting at the judges' table that night, who would you have handed the sando to? After that night in Las Vegas, history moved forward, but it was never viewed quite the same way again. Ronnie Coleman kept the title and extended his reign. He would go on to win 4 more consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, bringing his total to 8 between 1998 and 2005. In 2003, he reinvented himself entirely. He stepped on stage at nearly 300 pounds. That's about 136 kilograms, ushering in a new era of extreme mass in bodybuilding. That version of Ronnie redefined what big meant. The standard shifted. The ceiling felt like it disappeared. On the other side, Jay Cutler had to wait. The razor-thin loss in 2001 became fuel. He would finish second to Ronnie 3 more times. The title finally came in 2006, 5 years after that dramatic reversal. 5 years carrying the question of what might have been. And that's exactly where the biggest what if in bodybuilding history is born. What if Jay Cutler had won in 2001? What if he had snapped the streak right there? Would Ronnie Coleman still have gone on to win 8 titles? Would the entire narrative of the sport look different today? The 2001 Mr. Olympia wasn't just a close contest. It was a fork in the road. A moment that had the power to reshape 2 legacies at the exact same time. Like I mentioned throughout this video, that night wasn't just another edition of a major championship. It was one of those rare nights when sport moves beyond the stage and becomes history. In just a few hours, we saw a lead built, threatened, and completely reversed. A dramatic comeback that people still debate today like it happened yesterday. It was also a clear generational clash. On one side, Ronnie Coleman, the established champion, the ultimate symbol of the extreme mass era. On the other, Cutler, younger, hungry, and ready to claim the throne. This wasn't just about a trophy. It was about continuity versus change. The judging remains a hot topic to this day. That sharp shift in scoring between prejudging and the finals left a lasting mark. For some, it was pure credit to Ronnie's ability to respond under pressure. For others, it marked the beginning of a rivalry defined by controversial decisions and lingering, what could have been questions. But maybe what matters most is what followed. That loss shaped Cutler. That win strengthened Ronnie Coleman. And their rivalry helped define the modern era of bodybuilding. Without 2001, maybe we don't get the epic storyline that carried the sport through the years that followed. So now the question is yours. Was Cutler robbed? Or did Ronnie Coleman simply do what great champions do when their back is against the wall? Drop your opinion in the comments. Because some nights never really end. They just keep getting debated for generations.